Most often, after clinical death, people remember something pleasant, an unearthly light, communication with benevolent beings, a feeling of happiness. But sometimes there are stories that describe a terrible place, complete suffering and despair, that is, hell. This episode will talk about people who claim to have been to hell. Assistant engineer Thomas Welch for Oregon stumbled and fell from a height into the water while working on a future sawmill, hitting the shifted scaffold. Several people saw this and a search was immediately organized. About an hour later he was found and brought back to life. But Thomas's soul during this period of time was far from the scene of the tragedy. Having unexpectedly fallen from the bridge, he found himself near a huge fiery ocean. This sight amazed him and filled him with horror. A lake of fire extended around him and occupied the entire space, it seethed and rumbled. There was no one in it and Thomas himself watched it from the side. But there were quite a lot of people around, not in the lake itself, but next to it. Thomas even recognized one of those present, although he did not talk to him. They once studied together, but he died as a child from cancer. Those around were in some kind of thoughtfulness, they seemed to be confused, puzzled by the spectacle of a terrible lake of fire, next to which they found themselves. Thomas himself realized that together with them he was in a prison from which there was no way out. He thought that if he had known in advance about the existence of such a place, he would have tried during his lifetime to do everything in his power so as not to return here. As soon as these thoughts flashed through his head, Jesus himself appeared before him. Thomas was happy because he believed that he would help him get out of there, but he did not dare ask for help. Jesus passed by, noticing him, but before leaving, he turned and looked at him. This look returned Tommaso's soul to his body. He heard the voices of people nearby, and then was able to open his eyes and speak. This incident was described in the book by Moritz Rollins, entitled Beyond Death. There you can also read several more stories about how souls ended up in hell during clinical death. One patient died of a heart attack. She began to experience shortness of breath, after which she felt that she was separated from her body. Suddenly she found herself in a gloomy room, where she saw a terrible creature of enormous size. He watched her, dwarfs and demons were running nearby. This monster remembered her to come to him, the woman against her will followed him. There was darkness all around, people were moaning. Someone was running around her all the time, she felt their touch on her legs. Then the tunnel ended and she woke up among even more vile creatures. The woman cried, but could not change anything. But then the giant who accompanied her sent her back. She realized that she was pitted. That same minute she woke up in her bed in the hospital. Another patient began to experience severe pain due to inflammation of the pancreas. They gave him medicine, but they didn't help much and he lost consciousness. At that moment, he began to leave through a long tunnel. I was surprised that his legs did not touch him, he moved as if floating in space. This place was very similar to a dungeon or cave, filled with eerie sounds and smells of rotting. He forgot part of what he saw, but the villains, whose appearance was only half human, surfaced in his memory. They spoke their own language and mimicked each other. In despair, the dying man cried out, "Jesus, save me." A man in a shining robe immediately appeared and looked at him. He felt an indication that he needed to live differently. This man didn't remember anything else. Perhaps his consciousness did not want to keep in his memory all the horrors that he saw there. Kenneth Hagin, who became a priest after a near-death experience, described his visions and experiences in a pamphlet entitled My Testimony. On April 21, 1933, his heart stopped beating and his soul separated from his body. It began to descend lower and lower until the light of the earth completely disappeared. At the very end, he found himself in pitch darkness, in absolute blackness, where he could not even see a hand raised to his eyes. The further he descended, the hotter and stuffier the space around him became. Then he found himself facing the road to the underworld, where the lights of hell were visible. A fiery sphere was approaching him, which began to attract him to itself. The soul did not want to go, but could not resist, as it was attracted like iron to a magnet. Kenneth felt hot. He found himself at the bottom of the pit, with a certain creature next to him. At first he did not pay attention to it, mesmerized by the picture of hell spread out before him, but this creature put its hand between his elbow and shoulder to guide him into hell itself. At this time, a voice was heard, the voice of God himself. The future priest did not understand the words, but felt his strength and power. At that moment, his companion loosened his grip, and some force pulled him up. He found himself in his room and slipped into his body the same way he came out, through his mouth. The grandmother with whom he woke up spoke and admitted that she considered him already dead. There is a description of hell in Orthodox books. One man, suffering from illness, prayed to God to deliver him from his suffering. The angel sent by him suggested that the sufferer, instead of 1 year on earth, spend 3 hours in hell in order to cleanse his soul. He agreed, but as it turned out, it was in vain. It was the most disgusting place imaginable. Everywhere there was darkness, gloom, a spirit of malice was in the air, the cries of sinners were heard, and there was only suffering. The patient's soul experienced inexpressible fear and longing, but no one responded to his cries for help except the hellish echo and bubbling flames. It seemed to him that he had been there for an eternity, although the angel who visited him explained that only an hour had passed. The sufferer begged to be taken away from this terrible place and was released, after which he patiently endured his illness. According to the view of the Church, hell is a place where the souls of the dead are distant from God, sinners are tormented by remorse and unsatisfied passions, so weeping and gnashing of teeth are constantly heard there. The same needs that a person had on earth, in the underworld, will torment even more and will not be satisfied. Drug addicts will have eternal withdrawal, a drunkard will have a hangover, a smoker will have a craving for tobacco, a glutton will suffer without food, and a fornicator will suffer from the desires of the flesh. But oddly enough, hell was not created for punishment. It turns out that for a sinful soul, being close to God is also a kind of torture, since it is immersed in darkness and cannot rejoice in the light and graces. The pictures of hell are scary and unattractive, but they give a lot of reason to think about reconsidering your attitude towards life, your desires and goals.